It's just a few minutes past 6 o'clock. We've got a busy room this evening with lots of people joining us. Can I say a very warm welcome? I'm Anita Taylor. I'm the director of the Trinity Buoy Wharf Drawing Prize and Drawing Projects UK, and I'm also the Dean of Duncan of Jordenston College of Art and Design at the University of Dundee. And I'm really thrilled to welcome so many people to the drawing discussions that are accompanying the Trinity Buoy Wharf Drawing Prize while it should be in London. The image that you have in front of you is Trinity Buoy Wharf. It is where the 2020 exhibition is currently installed, but very sadly, we're unable to visit the exhibition, but we do have a fantastic opportunity to meet some of the artists as we go through our drawing discussions and other events this week. So the drawing discussions we've set up, this is the first of the paired artists. We've set up a series which bring together two of the exhibitors in the exhibition who've been selected for the Trinity Buoy Wharf Drawing Prize. And we've put together artists so that we can hear from them individually about their work. And we're really focused on the work in the exhibition. The Trinity Buoy Wharf Drawing Prize is selected from the drawings themselves, and we take that forward into these discussions so that we can consider drawings themselves and think about how we can have a debate and a dialogue, a sense of understanding with the benefit of the maker of the drawing to hear a little bit more about their context and the drawing itself. So I'm really thrilled that this evening we've got Chua and Ruth Richmond joining us. We're going to invite them to speak in turn, and then we'll open up for questions and discussion. I have Fiona Cassidy with me, who is with Drawing Projects UK and looking after the Q&A. So please do put questions that you have in the Q&A function. We will also monitor the chat, but it will be brilliant if we have them in the Q&A. We are going to record the session this evening, and we hope that we'll be able to share it later. We always never guarantee because the technology sometimes lets us down, but fingers crossed. So without further ado, I think we've got a really enthusiastic audience this evening. I can see lots of very supportive comments in the chat already. And I'm really thrilled to welcome Nina and Ruth, who are going to share with all that generosity some information and their thoughts around their work. So first of all, I'm going to ask Nina. So Ruth and Fiona and I will disappear a little from the screen. I may stay on screen, Nina, so that you're talking to somebody, which helps, but we'll mute and disappear. So without further ado, I'm really thrilled to welcome Nina. Nina's currently living and working in Manchester, and she is a graduate of Manchester Metropolitan University and Manchester School of Art, and she's been showing quite extensively in Europe, actually. So it would be really great to hear more about you and more about your drawing in the Trinity Buoy Wharf Drawing Prize 2020. Thank you, Nina. And I'll move the slide for you. Over to you. Sorry. You need to unmute.
Can you hear me? Yes, good. Thank you for that introduction. So I'll just go straight into it. So I make drawings using marker pen on paper, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about my work, tracing the development from flat to 3D and leading to the drawing in the Trinity Buoy Wharf drawing show, which you can see on the screen now. So I come from a textile background. I studied embroidery, so it's always been second nature for me to approach drawing from both sides of the paper, turning the material from one side to the other, similar to sewing by hand, the line making its way across as well as through the material like a line of stitches would. Because of my background, I've always been aware and worked with paper as a 3D object rather than a flat surface. The materiality of the paper, its weight, the way it rolls and crumples, literally and conceptually shapes the work. In 2017, I started to make A4 drawings with horizontal lines on one side and vertical lines on the other. Could you change the slide, Anita, please? Yeah, this is the one. It's an expanded grid that meshes together through the paper. There's a visual quality to both sides, but I show them pinned flat to the wall so that only one side is visible. Despite this flat way of showing, I think that the sense of the drawing as an object is not lost because the colour bleeds through from one side to the other. The materiality of the paper, its thinness, is revealed through its saturation, and the paper is the type of cheap A4 copy paper that most people use and have a tactile awareness of. So later, yeah, great, thank you. I made a number of large double-sided drawings that I also show pinned flat to the wall or pinned to the wall, but these ones curl up at the edges to give a hint of what's underneath. Realizing that there is something on the other side whilst not being able to fully see it changes how the drawing might be perceived. At least in my mind it does, because I'm aware that not everything is on display. There are things that I can't see and may never know, information that's unavailable to me. There's something concealed, private, and unknowable about the drawing that opens up the space of the imagination and the mind. Seeing and knowing, not seeing and not knowing, the idea of knowing something through seeing it. This makes the experience of looking from flat to 3D very different, because what is presented in 3D cannot be seen from any one angle. There is always something hidden from view at any given moment. The first freestanding drawings, next slide please, thank you. These were made on large sheets of paper covered in lines, then rolled up so most of the drawing was hidden inside. I show these as a vertical roll. Again, these drawings are as much about what cannot be seen as what can be seen. They have an interiority. The paper was purchased on a roll and retains the memory in its form, and the drawings reflect this. Sometimes the drawings are slightly compressed from storage, so they take on an oval shape. In theory, they could be unrolled to reveal the full drawing inside, but they would never go back to quite the same state again. Knowledge would be gained, but the form would be changed. Their standing height of 150 centimeters is typical modern hanging height for wall-based work. And I like this continuity between what's hanging on the wall and what stands on the floor. Next slide, please. So this is another rolled up drawing. Yeah, just for your information. And then if we can go back to the drawing in the Trinity Buoy Wharf show, please. Thank you. So now I come to the drawing in the show. It's covered with black marker pen on both sides of the paper and then crushed into form. I think about it like a compression of time because the process of covering the paper is very time consuming. This is then followed by the quick act of crushing. Crushing is a destructive action, one that damages the paper and fractures the surface, but also leads to something new. The drawing goes from being hung from pins in the wall to being a freestanding object that no longer needs a support to hold it. In this sense, it asserts itself by taking up space and getting in the way. We must move around it. This changes the dynamic because we encounter it physically, not just visually. Sculpture addresses us in a different way from wall-based work. In this instance, when the drawing is standing on the floor, as we do, we look down upon it, which makes us aware of scale and our size in relation to it and its fragility. Sculpture comes with a different set of concerns from drawing, for example, whether or not to use a plinth. In the two iterations of the show so far, the same drawing has been shown both on a plinth and on the floor, and this has changed the way I think about it. The rejection of the plinth by modern artists is something that sets apart a modern sculpture from a traditional one. They rejected it for the same reasons that it was traditionally employed. A plinth elevates a sculpture, setting it apart from the world of other things and marking a space around it. The literal and symbolic elevation of sculpture on a plinth, tied to its function as monument, can appear pompous, a way of giving weak sculpture authority, of distinguishing it and adding value. It also connects a sculpture to its symbolic function as a marker of historical significance. I think these complexities are to be embraced, putting a drawing on a plinth to see how its reception changes and the value judgments that arise from it. The drawing on the plinth appears anchored, perhaps to a certain tradition. The same drawing can have a different life as a freestanding, autonomous, self-referential object. In some ways, when I see the drawing freestanding, it has the effect of making it appear more detached from the world than if it was on a plinth. Unweighed by tradition, it seems disconnected, self-contained, and singular. When I think of crumpled bits of paper, an image of launching balls of paper at the rubbish bin comes to mind. The association being that something went wrong on the paper, that it was a bad drawing. This, however, is not the case. A bad drawing will not become a good drawing when it is crushed. So when does a drawing lend itself to being crushed? What can be resolved through crushing? When is crushing it not a compromise? Now, if we imagine a double-sided drawing, one marked on both sides of the paper, a flat position allows us to see one side. When the drawing is curled up, it allows us to see a hint of the other side. When the drawing is crushed, it allows us to see a mix of both sides, as if swirled together. However, crushing destroys the possibility of seeing the whole thing, since some information is lost inside the form. So I can say that a drawing lends itself to being crushed when both sides should be seen together. Other instances include when secret information is revealed in the process of drawing, information that the artist had no intention of revealing and is surprised at revealing and wants to hide it from view. When the surface of the drawing has a simplicity and purity that allows form to come to the fore, and conversely, when the surface of a drawing is chaotic, when the visual information is too much and overwhelms the senses. It lends itself to crushing because crushing removes information, which is otherwise very difficult to achieve because the marks on the paper cannot be covered or removed. The last instance I can think of is when a drawing needs to move beyond the artist's control, because one can't fully control the way a drawing crumples, folds in on itself, or what the final shape will be. Of course, this work can be thought of as both drawing and sculpture, but for me, it's more interesting to think about it in terms of drawing, because it is rooted in the logic of drawing, and therefore questions the condition of drawing more than the condition of sculpture. To think about it the other way around is to lose the sense of line, surface, and paper as a catalyst for thinking and acting. And that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Nina. That's a really terrific, concise overview of the work. And maybe if we just flick through the works as we move forward. And this drawing we didn't really focus on so much.
One, yes.
Yeah. Which is really lovely in terms of its colour in relationship to the one that's very dark and brooding, if you like, that's in the exhibition.
Yeah.
Shall we, our process this evening was to, unless there are any immediate questions, was to move to our second artist. It's a little bit like blind date, isn't it? Putting two people together and hearing about their work and then their conversation. So I wonder if what we should do is introduce Ruth and then we'll open up the conversation. I think you've positioned some really beautiful thoughts about the role of drawing, and I love the sense of the work being rooted in the logic of drawing, and that's really where its questioning nature and basis is. So I think it will be terrific. So Ruth, we'd like to invite you. So thank you, Nina. We'll come back to you with questions and discussions, I'm sure. And I'm just trying to get Ruth back on the screen. If you're happy to join us, Ruth. Yeah, brilliant.
Okay.
That's fantastic. So welcome, Ruth Richmond.
Can you see me?
We
Yes.
can see you, which is great. And Ruth
Okay.
is joining us. You're joining us from Suffolk today. And Ruth studied
I
fine
am.
art at Norwich University of the Arts and MA drawing at Wimbledon College of Art. And again has been showing in a number of mixed shows and solo shows. And we're really looking forward to hearing about the 5 lockdown soul polls. So thank you, Ruth.
Thank you, Anita. Thank you very much. I have to say it's been lovely having this opportunity to have a look further into my work and research it in such depth to actually be able to talk about it for 10 minutes. So I'm discussing these lockdown soul polls. Each one represents an immediate member of my family while we were tackling the COVID-19 lockdown. These are 5 poles. The height is 1.8 to 2.2 meters. They're leaning against the wall in the gallery, which you can see, and as a collective suggest a family group. I have drawn reductive lines into the hazel pole with a hot metal point. The wood is burnt to create an indent, which through the burning process has been colored a dark umber. Sometimes the lines join up so that the starting point of the line also becomes the end point too. So in effect, the line becomes a complete circle around the stem. This, however, is a random gesture. It is not important that it should meet up. The circling can be completed by an extra line. These random reductive lines leave variant gaps in between which have been filled by a chalk paint. This allows the stem to breathe and to continue its cyclical journey through to decomposition. I selected different hues of white as my base colours, reflecting the variance in nature as a clean and fresh start without history. The paint is partially absorbed into the grain of the wood, allowing the surface to be evident, but it is an additive mark. A white shroud is used to cover a dead body, a respect for the passing, but opening the way for a new beginning. White depicts purity, innocence, wholeness, and completion. As well as the horizontal lines following the circumference of the pole are incidental shapes, ellipses, circles, and small horizontal gaps left by the mismatch of the seared line. These have been filled in with a dark umber to match the lines and to offer a balance of power between the whites, lights, and darks. I am suggesting the burnt umber is bruising, depicting the knocks in life and the interruption of the good times when we are needing support and rigorous determination to overcome them. I suggest that they enhance the emphasis, the sweetness, and importance of reliability and connectivity, which is the dominant area shown in white. Why wooden poles? I was looking for a way of working euphemistically in the landscape. I wanted an organic vessel which carries the significance and vulnerability of human and vegetation combined. But it needed to be an object that commanded its surroundings. Overgrown and overcrowded hazel trees in our hedgerows between fields were bountiful. They were needy, and I thought selected carefully and worked on sympathetically could answer this personal quest. Coppicing the hazelwood could help these overcrowded trees too, and I could use the cut-out stems for my work. These seem like the answer. Also, I could bring them into my environment, work on them, and replace them anywhere I chose. Could I have the second image, please? Okay, so this is me with a chainsaw cutting down the stems. The center is me, obviously the stems I've cut down, and the one on the right is me using a spoke shave to take off the outer layer and smooth it down. I always start with a plan, but I'm open to new thoughts and ideas as they arise, and often the pole itself dictates these. The shape of the poles vary just as any natural product, some slightly curved, some have cracks, and some with calluses in different heights. All these idiosyncrasies indicate a uniqueness and individual character. They are obviously a grouping from the same nest or genus, but show up as individuals too, such as a human family. The simple repetitive line formations become contour lines. They hug the tree. Sometimes they are wobbly and unsure, and occasionally become other shapes too. They show the hours and days that drifted by and express my time and thoughts in this format. These are now visible on the poles as a visual translation, simplified and manifested into a timeline. They are like a dream of subconsciousness, freed from an inarticulate and possibly unidentified emotion or sensation. A mechanism of expressing and visualizing these. Making during the COVID. At the beginning of the first lockdown, I began this project using poles left from a previous project. I set up my studio under a tree and started drawing. It became an obsession and totally absorbed my emotional need, and with the fine weather and long days, I was able to spend many hours working. Initially though, I wasn't sure of my journey. My vulnerability matched the outside news, and I was just pleased to have a project to put my reactions and energy into. This project became my altar family as I worked under my studio tree, making my own woodland family. Why Woodlands? Oliver Rackham, an historical ecologist particularly interested in woodlands, said in his book called Woodlands, "Trees are wildlife, just as deer or primroses are. Each species has its own agenda and its own interactions with human activities." As a 5-year-old, I would walk to and play in a chestnut wood, excuse me, on the farm close by where I grew up. I was an only child. The trees were my neighbours. They were my friends and my playmates. The soul poles have become my adult way of interacting with them and creating another family. In Peter Woolliban's book, The Hidden Life of Trees, he discusses how the forests work as a community, supporting not only their own offspring and family, but their neighbours and the underground mycelial network, adding a physical and nutritional link too. They all make up a wood-wide web system, reminding me of our human social network. I continue daily to walk through the woods and take comfort in its steadfastly omnipresent friendships. There is, of course, a long history of humans using wood for shelter. And of course, we are familiar with totems or talismans used for centuries in many civilizations. Wooden poles are also used as pathfinders, signposts, electricity, or for telephone communication lines. These are all human interventions placed in the landscape, either for ceremonial or practical reasons. Next slide, please. Not forgetting Brancusi's endless column, which suggests the meeting of the underland with the heavens. And now the next slide, please. Thank you. Drawing from 2D to 3D. Firstly, I'm taking the drawing off the page onto the 3D textured wood surface. The wooden branch is half the context. The added drawing and the use of the space and lines made by the composition become a construct for human intervention. Next was to plan how to make the surface right for the project, and also how to make the reductive lines, taking away from the surface rather than adding to it. I am tracing using manual gestures, using touch and pressure to imprint the line. One mark decides the next. I use this method when I'm drawing pencil on paper. There is a starting point, but not a preordained end one. This allows for flexibility in the decision-making process. Thirdly, a collection of 3D objects allows for changing and repositioning the finished work into different contexts and figurations. There is no correct way to place them. They have their own message and relationship, which change as the venue and placement of them change too. The relationships evolve and sometimes feel better one way or another. It's a personal perception. When arranged in a 3D form or sequence, there is a line stretching from one pole to another, which changes as they are moved, changing the viewer's experience. As does the spatial relationship from viewer to pole and from pole to pole. So what have I learned? I have developed a system of drawing which uses the context represented by the surface on which I draw as significant as the materials I draw with and the marks I make on it. I have moved from a sheet of paper and set my thoughts, emotions, and inspirations to share into a 3D visual scape. The landscape is brought into an interior space and its strength and the outdoor reference is not diminished. I want to be able to show the work inside and outside. When outside, I'm in the landscape, but when inside, the landscape is brought into me. Sympathetic and rhythmical mark making onto 5 similar poles creates an obvious relationship between them. Each one has an individual character that emanates and links from the same source, genus and grouping, family. What now? I'm now working on a series of autumn soul poles using a hint of gold signifying the colours and optimism shown by beautiful precious silver birch trees who helped inspire me each autumn morning. Alongside my poles, I still have a busy hand wanting to draw with a pencil on paper. So I'm now also working on a very large scale winter project as part of my forest floor collection, which is a study in detail of forgotten undergrowth and foliage. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. That was really terrific. 2 fantastic presentations and really exciting in terms of thinking about what drawing can be. And I'm very struck about the way that you, Ruth, are drawing on the object. And actually, Nina, you're talking about the drawing as object. And I think there's something really beautiful about that differentiation and thinking about what that means in terms of drawing in 3 dimensions or drawing in space, because these are object-rooted drawings in space. I'm just trying to unmute Nina, who's not unmuted yet. Brilliant, that's fantastic. We're all 3 on the call, which is good. So it's really 2 really interesting, very focused presentations about the drawing. We've intended people to talk very specifically about the drawing in the show. The image that you have on screen is the work installed, which may not show the work to its best, but is actually at Trinity Buoy Wharf in London, and with one of the selectors, Francis Morris, actually in the space, looking at the work, which is great to see. But I don't know if we have any questions from the floor, or if you have indeed questions for each other, but there's something very beautiful about the turning inside out and the turning the outside out to the world. I mean, there is a very beautiful sense of their spatial occupancy, which is very different, the sense of their articulation of drawing being quite distinctive. And in a funny sort of way, they're both very much about a landscape, one being a landscape of the paper and one being a reflection on the landscape taken from it. There's a question in the chat which is about your materials, well, both of your materials. One for you, Ruth, which is on what are they made? What are the stems? What kind of wood, I guess, are they? I don't know if you want to say that again. Comment.
Sorry, yes, they are. Sorry, I brain freeze.
Hazel. You said they were hazel.
Coppiced hazel branches. Yeah.
So that answers that question, which is great. And then, yes, absolutely. Can you hear us? And the question really also for Nina is there's a question about the black, the sense of the black on the work that's selected for the show. The others are very colourful works, very systematically applied marks. And I think the thing that's rather beautiful about the work in the show, I think you should answer it, is it looks very uniform in colour in reproduction, and I wondered if you might want to comment on that too.
Yeah, well, I only use marker pens, so essentially what the black surface is made up by lots and lots of lines, so it's not that dissimilar from the colourful surfaces. It's just that you can see the lines separately, but the black one is just a thin marker pen, and I've just it's also quite thin paper, so the marker pen saturates through, and so you get quite a dense and even colour until you look quite close up, and then you can see that the sort of striations of you know, and you can see that it's made up of lots of lines essentially.
It's incredibly labour intensive, isn't it, actually, in terms of the marking and the surface?
Yeah, it is quite, that's why I think about it like a compression of time, because it is time consuming to cover the paper with just, and also because marker pens are thin, it's not like in painting where you can scale up the mark by using a bigger brush to cover a larger surface. I'm always using a relatively small point to cover a big surface, so it does take a fair amount of time. And then, you know, this act of sort of crushing it really, and really you know, squashing it, I feel like that's, then you go from that very labor intensive, time consuming action to that very quick action.
And in terms of, I mean, that actions, I mean, you talk about there is an aggression or a violence in doing something like that to these rather beautifully rendered surfaces, which are, you know, drawn from both sides.
Yeah, but I think it's it leads to something new, which is, and it also takes the whole process out of my control, because like I said in the presentation, when you crush it, you can't control how it's going to buckle and fold and what it's going to become. So I like that sort of sense of losing control, and like I think Ruth mentioned it about a sort of starting point, and then it's sort of meandering and going somewhere where you didn't expect it to. And I think I always start a drawing with just something very slight in mind, and you know, and that makes it very different from a sort of designed process. You know, it's something very slight that triggers it, and then it sort of meanders off and you know, does something unexpected. And that's what I look for in a drawing. I always look for it to do something different from the last one and present me with something new to look at. And I think that crushing it gives a sort of surprise element, and it doesn't always work out. Some of them, you know, just don't end up being.
Do you want to say a bit I mean, the cylindrical works are very different from the crushed works, yet they operate in space very elegantly. They're still using the same process of the lines and adapting paper to take this spatial form.
Yeah, I suppose it's more close to the papers, how the paper arrives in my studio in its rolled form. So there's less sort of tampering with it to get it, you know, it's sort of more in a, it's, I think crushing it is a more sort of definite action to create a form. But still there's this sense of the information that's contained inside. So I think there's a sort of that links them together.
Yeah, they invite you to really explore them when you're in the space with them. So it's that sense of wanting to explore the other side or the inside or the underneath, because they're, you know, they're clearly things that you could see in many ways, as you've referred to. And there's something about both of your work. You know, I've been involved in seeing it and installing it in 2-3 venues now. and that it's transformative in the way that they sit together, and the way that Ruth's becomes a family. Sometimes they don't feel like a family. Sometimes they can actually be quite isolated in the way that we present them. So there's an invitation to play, which I find really exciting within both of the works. There's a couple of questions coming in, so please do put some questions into the chat. I know we've got some comment about the noise. I'm not quite sure what that is, or I'm not hearing it, but other people might be. But Ruth, there's a question for you about the kind of pigments you're using and what they are, and are they natural or man-made? And a question about the burning. And is it ritualistic? Is it ritualistic as a process?
I hadn't considered it especially being ritualistic, apart from on my own ritual, not in another sort of higher being or anything else. It is a ritual. It becomes a ritual, I guess, just by the constancy of it and the repeated nature of it, and what you're thinking while you're doing it, and what's going on and how you're making your decisions. But so yes and no, take that as you like. But the paint is chalk paint. On previous polls that I've done, I've actually made my own paints, made them in glare paint, using soils and found pigments, natural pigments from where the poles have come from. But these ones I used chalk paint, but I wanted to use natural paint, so they are natural chalk paints, which do breathe, as I said, so that the poles will still be able to breathe and decompose eventually, as and when. Hopefully not yet, but at some point. So there's nothing man-made on there. Which
is really important. It's a very determined decision, isn't it?
Yes.
Around
yes,
that.
for sure.
There's another
very
question
much so.
coming in which follows up on that, which is from Georgie Hawkes, which is, do you feel a resonance of the ancients who may have coppiced the hazel before you?
Oh, I like that one. I guess I do. It's all very ancient, isn't it? Woodland is very ancient. So there is always a historiology involved in that. And the fact that they've seen generations before you. So yes, I suppose I do. I like that. I like the idea, yes.
And in terms of, you talked about the polls you've made before and the polls that you're doing now. I mean, there are also all sorts of other references to polls within that kind of sense of talking to the soul or to ancients or different heritage. And I wondered if you might want to say something around that, any other kind of references that they bring, because they're very immediate in terms of their physicality, that they're hazel, they're coppiced, they're drawn on, and the drawn marks respond very much to the surface of the hazel.
Well, they're very personal to me, simply because they grow where I live. I cut them down. I mean, I select them, I cut them down, I work on them. And so there's a long process while I'm working on them that I go through before I even start the drawing. So I can't remember the question.
The question was really thinking about other references, and maybe, you know, if you think about other cultures where there are references to making pole images, if you think about Indigenous Australia or other things. And I just wondered, because actually they're very situated in the personal and the experiential in the landscape. So I'm not necessarily making that allusion, but I think it's a question that people have when they see the work.
Yes. I'm very conscious of that, and I'm very aware that I don't want to take away from cultures that have been doing it for centuries and thousands of years. So I very much want to make them mine. So they are of today. They are of now. Yes. They're not.
And they're
they're contemporary. you know, I mean, yes, I really admire the Larrakitch Australian Aboriginal poles and the other poles that you're mentioning, but they are definitely of now, and I like to feel that I'm owning them and they are from me.
I think they're also of place, aren't they? So I think there's something else that runs with that too. There's a question in,
Yes.
there are lots of things about process, and to some degree, partly you've both positioned process quite heavily. So Em Lowram, who's also an artist in the show, everyone's saying thank you for the talk, by the way. But her question, or their question, is it more important to you than the outcome in the creative process and the conversation, the dialogue that's coming through that material making and process?
Is this for
So
me?
I think it's for both of you. It's directed at both of you.
Oh, okay.
Who would like to go first?
Shall I answer?
Ruth.
I mean, the process is definitely the important thing, and the process evolves into what it has become. I think I mentioned in my talk that I just started out making marks, and I'm not quite sure where it was going. It was just in total involvement, and then I started to realize what was happening. I was actually referencing my family and everything that was going on at the time around us. And it was enabling me to just work. And that's how I work. I'm very instinctive. I don't have a huge plan. So yeah, one mark makes the next mark, and the next mark makes the next mark. And so then it becomes something. It's a becoming, I guess.
Yeah, that's a great answer to that. Nina, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's sort of almost the other way around for me. It's the thing itself has to be intriguing and visually, you know, gives me something, and hopefully then the viewer, and that is really the most important bit to me. You know, it's what it does once it's made, and I think if it doesn't do something interesting visually, I would disregard it, even if the process was very involved, because I think yeah, it has to, the process isn't enough really for me. It's it's a way of getting to something, but that something has to be interesting and in its own right, I think.
Yeah, well, I think there's that thing of the becoming, and I think that's the critical relationship. And for one, it's about the progression. And I guess in a way that the copyist wood actually has a self-contained form, which perhaps in a way also contains the way that you approach it in a different way to Nina, because actually the paper is almost, can do anything, can't it? I mean, paper is one of the most flexible, adaptable media to some degree, and the way that you're using it and your approach to transforming it really pushes that endeavour.
I think you're right, because paper is incredibly flexible and malleable, and you can do a lot with it in a sort of as a sculptural material, but we tend to think of it as a flat thing, as a surface, because you know, that's its useful function, is as a surface. So it's just moving away from its kind of useful function and just, I suppose, looking at it slightly differently.
And I'm also struck, I mean, we're looking at that photograph. I mean, your drawing, Nina, feels heavy and rooted to the floor when it's a floor piece, and yet it's light and very, very light, really lightweight and not flimsy by any means, because it's really strong and tensile.
It's interesting to hear you say that, because I haven't really thought of it in that way, but I think maybe it's because it looks like you say, quite heavy and dense, but maybe I suppose because I've actually picked it up, so I know it's so light and relatively fragile. So
yeah, and I think actually with Ruth, the surprise with yours is the weight. Somehow you don't quite expect them to be as solid and heavy as they actually are. You know, their solidity is really integral to their making, but you still are quite surprised.
Yes, I guess you are. But for me, the stem is actually introducing the context of the piece anyway. Before I even do anything onto it, it's already suggesting a huge amount. Maybe a piece of paper, until you actually do something with it, doesn't have any suggestion.
Yeah, I often think that, you know, before, sometimes, I don't know if this happens to you, you can have a sort of stretches of time which are quite, when nothing's triggering really, and you have a sort of, you know, blank sort of time where you're not very productive in this, sometimes I think it just, that looking at a sheet of paper and, you know, that blank surface, and wondering, you could do anything, but what do you do? That's like an eternal question for me, you know, just, well, now what do I do? Now where does it go? You know, and there's so much potential, and at the same time that, you know, that can be very freeing, but it can also be quite
intimidating.
Yes, that's the
but that's the joy of making, isn't it? It's that tightrope. I'm sorry, there is a train going by, so the scratchy noise might be a train, which goes past my studio quite regularly. But there is something about the tension of making, isn't it? It's a precipice of whether it's going to work or not, and that, I guess, in the work that you have, that's really fundamentally part of its success and failure. You know, the risk that you take with it.
Yeah.
There's a question in which is about, and I'm not quite sure who it's directed at, it's from Susan, and the work which talks about the work being very textural and tactile, and it makes the viewer want to touch and explore around and underneath. And the question is it something you invite?
For me, not really, no, because I think it goes back to that sort of idea that there's the drawing has a sort of private dimension, and that we don't need to see everything. You know, there's something intriguing about imagining what you can't see or you can't know. So I don't really invite people to pick them up, and I don't even always show all sides to the drawing. So yeah.
That's a very clear position, which I think is really nice. What about you, Ruth? I mean, I've took the privilege of handling the work, so.
Yeah, no, I'm very happy. I think that's part of it, is the tactility of the piece. And as, I mean, hopefully my close-up showed, there are lots of knots and little holes and all sorts of things in there, which all add to the texture and the interest of the piece. So very much so, yeah, I think that I would want to myself, if they weren't mine, I would want to go and touch them. I mean, it's definitely a way of understanding something, isn't it? And in fact, I think the more it's touched, the better it'll become. It'll become a sort of burnished piece, which I love the idea of that, the history of who's touched it before.
Yeah, I mean, those are two very intrinsically different
yeah,
but I think that's really interesting to hear. There's a question about Nina's work, or a comment to start it, which is when it's placed on the floor, it has a vulnerability.
Yeah.
And the question being asked it's a comment about a curiosity about the distancing and security the plinth gives to the work. And it's a question about whether you've considered how this brings the work closer to the viewer.
Being on a plinth, or
I think so.
Yeah, I mean, I think just physically, if it's on a plinth, I mean, it can literally raise it closer to your eyes. So in that way, you can maybe look at it more closely and sort of understand it more by looking at it in that way. And then I think when it's on the floor, it does look quite vulnerable sometimes, and it just gives you this different sense of almost like your the sense of scale of, you know, of your own physicality in relation to it. So yeah, I think it's changes it quite fundamentally, really, you know, moving it from a plinth to being on the floor. And I quite like, I like that the drawing can have different, it can perform in different ways, you know, and it can have different lives, you know, it can and it can connect to the sort of history of the plinth. And at the same time, it can be this sort of very singular, self-contained thing on the floor, which, yeah, I think it's quite interesting to see it in different ways.
Yeah, and it invites you to really inspect it. I mean, I think there is something both on the floor and on the plinth. So I think it's a drawing that does take some time to experience. And, you know, and I know in reproduction, sometimes people sort of think, I mean, that sense that it is a solid mass of black, which it's not at all. And there's a very beautiful white edge of the paper that runs through that crumpledness, which is really elegant. And, you know, one of the things that I think is characteristic of the selection, and very much something that selectors talked about, is the quality of line that runs through the show. And your piece has that very intimate, I mean, you both have that as a quality within the work. But that white line is just really quite mesmerizing in the piece.
Yeah, I think I read somewhere something that Ruth said about the negative space being, you know, as potent as the positive space. And sometimes I think, you know, I have spend all that time applying the lines, and then it's the bit with no application of color onto it at all, and that's what ends up really attracting the eye almost, you know, the bit where it's uncovered.
But it actually allows you to explore the form and the crush, if you like, because it takes you into the space. There are a couple more comments, one around, one simply saying that it would also be interesting to see it suspended, so that it's not always about the floor and being weighted or having a surface to sit on.
The only problem for me with the suspension aspect is I kind of like not to have too much theatricality around it, you know. I like it to kind of do what it does, and the plinth has a sort of art historical precedent, so I think as a piece of gallery furniture it's completely acceptable because it has a long history, whereas when you suspend something and you have the you know, whatever the technicalities and whatever bits of equipment you use to suspend it, then it adds this sort of element of theatre and drama that maybe I'm not sure if I would sort of want that for the work almost.
Yeah, it would change it in some ways. It gives a different relationship to the surface, but it would require a structure that somehow the simplicity of sitting on the floor or on a surface gives it a permission to be in space. I think there's one other question for you, Ruth, which is, can the family identify which of the poles are them? I think it's a question, are they portraits? I mean, they stand for the family, but are they actually individual portraits to that degree?
No. I think each member of the family has selected their own. They identify with it. I wouldn't like to suggest which was which. It's just they were all combined. It's like a family. We're all combined. You know, we're a mixture of lots of things, but we come from the same source. And I like to think that's the same with the pole.
And that's a brilliant place to conclude, I think, which is a great answer to that question. It is coming up, it's 5 to 7, so we've talked almost for an hour, which has been really brilliant. And you've both been incredibly eloquent and incredibly generous in talking about the ideas, the process, your understanding and criteria, I think, in terms of drawing, the logic of drawing and the place that it's taken you to through these 2 pieces of work, I think has been incredibly illuminating. And you've talked very generously for everybody and taken on their questions too. There are lots of very positive thank yous and comments coming in through the chat, but it's an enormous thank you to you. It's a huge congratulations on being selected for the exhibition. As you'll know, it was a submission of 4,200 and something works, and we have 71 drawings in the exhibition overall. So I'd like to say a huge congratulations, one enormous thank you, and just to say what a privilege it is to have these drawings in the exhibition and how much we've really enjoyed working with them to date. The exhibition in London sadly is unable to open at present because of the public health constraints. I'd just like to remind people that we are holding the online launch tomorrow and the announcement of the awards. So people, please join us. We will be sharing a link so that people can join the event and watch that announcement in the live timeline that we anticipated. Doing that from 6 o'clock tomorrow evening. And please join in all of the other online events that we have running until the 22nd of January, which would have been alongside the exhibition. We will get back out on tour. We've been really lucky. We've shown it in Wiltshire, we've shown it in Dundee. We really hoped for the 3rd time lucky in London, but we, during projects, the University of Dundee and Trinity Buoy Wharf, who are the most fantastic supporters and sponsors of drawing and this project, are very keen that we make this as accessible as we can. And we've taken the opportunity to make a virtual online exhibition that we'll be launching on Thursday, I believe. I was about to say December. It feels like it's been a long year already, this last 2 weeks. But can I say again, once again, an enormous thank you to Nina and to Ruth, to Fiona for steering us through the evening. But Nina and Ruth, you're the stars of the discussion this evening. Thank you so much. And we'll say farewell to our audience and look forward to meeting up again very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.